abandoned during childbirth. Kara discovered her home-based secret trip to Miami. So us and we follow how this intelligent accountant orchestrated a perfect legal defense silent jet is fascinating. Welcome to the channel, the choir of broken heart.
I stepped into my scheduled C-section at Boulder Community Hospital with a lingering fear, but the firm promise from my husband that he would stay by my side provided the only comfort I needed. My name is Kara. I am 34 years old, and as a professional accountant, I have spent a decade analyzing structural integrity through numbers without ever realizing that my own marriage was built on a crumbling foundation. The anesthesia took hold shortly after Jared whispered that he would be waiting right outside those double doors. Yet the reality I woke up to was a sterile room filled only with the rhythmic beeping of monitors. Day one passed in a haze of post-surgical pain, where I scanned the doorway every time it creaked, expecting him to burst in with a frantic apology or a celebratory bouquet. By day two, the silence of my phone became a physical weight, because every call I placed went straight to a cold voicemail, while I struggled to lift our newborn son alone. The nurses began to exchange glances that I pretended not to notice, until day 7 arrived, bringing with it a complication in my blood pressure that extended my stay against my will. It was then that a nurse named Anne looked at my empty bedside chair and asked where the father was, a question that shattered the fragile lies I had been telling myself for a week. By the afternoon of that 7th day, I was forced to sign my own discharge papers with a trembling hand, before clutching my son and a single bag of belongings to hail a ride home. Welcome to Kara's Raw Revenge, so get settled because this story is going to take you somewhere unexpected. Drop a comment to let me know where you are watching from, then hit that like button, and make sure you are subscribed, because you are going to love the justice served here. I finally pulled into the driveway of the house I bought with my own hard-earned savings long before I ever met the man I thought was my partner. As the front door swung open, the scent of a life continuing without me filled the air, and my eyes landed on the first piece of evidence that would change everything forever. The thick scent of surgical antiseptic and the persistent rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor were the only things confirming my existence within the sterile confines of the post-operative recovery room. I was 34 years old, an age when I should have been celebrating the peak of my life, yet I found myself tethered to a hospital bed while my body struggled to recover from a complicated C-section. My doctor had strictly ordered me to remain under close observation for a full 7 days because my blood pressure refused to stabilize after the surgery, which stretched my expected stay into an agonizing period of isolation. I spent those long hours staring fixatedly at the heavy wooden door of my room every single time I heard footsteps echoing down the linoleum hallway. Each shadow that passed beneath the doorframe sent a jolt of desperate hope through my chest as I imagined Jared finally rushing in with a frantic explanation for his week-long disappearance. To shield myself from the crushing weight of pity from the medical staff, I found myself fabricating elaborate lies for my primary nurse, Anne, claiming that my husband was simply buried under insurance paperwork in the administrative offices downstairs. Anne moved with a quiet efficiency as she adjusted my intravenous fluids, but I could feel the heaviness of her silent observation whenever she noticed my phone sitting untouched on the bedside table. The raw truth of my situation became impossible to ignore by the third night, when every single call I placed to Jared was instantly diverted to his cold, impersonal voicemail. My newborn son lay in his clear plastic bassinet just a few feet away, needing his father's presence while I struggled to find the strength to even reach for a glass of water. On the 4th morning, Anne assisted me with changing my heavy abdominal bandages and spoke with a gentle, filtered compassion that made my throat tighten with suppressed emotion. She looked directly into my tired eyes and suggested that I should perhaps reach out to other family members because my physical recovery was being hindered by the clear signs of emotional distress. I merely nodded in a polite, distant manner while pretending to focus on the nutritional information printed on my plastic water pitcher to avoid her discerning gaze. The remaining days crawled by in a blur of medication cycles and the hollow sound of other patients in nearby rooms receiving joyful visits from their laughing families. By the time the afternoon of the seventh day arrived, the silence in my room had become a permanent resident that I no longer tried to fight with hopeful fantasies. I managed to stand on my own shaky legs to finalize the discharge paperwork, signing each document with a hand that refused to stop trembling despite my efforts to appear composed. Since no one had come to assist with the financial arrangements, I pulled my personal credit card from my wallet to settle the remaining balance of the hospital fees myself. I slowly gathered the small pile of baby blankets and my own few belongings into a single bag, while Anne watched me from the doorway with a frown of deep concern. She reached out to steady the handles of my son's car seat as I prepared to navigate the long journey toward the hospital exit without any support. Anne stopped me near the heavy glass sliding doors of the main lobby and asked in a low, hesitant voice if my husband was truly not coming to help me carry the luggage and the baby. I deliberately turned my face away toward the bright, unforgiving sunlight of the parking lot to hide the fact that my eyes were beginning to sting with tears. I forced a small, with a brittle smile, she told her that he was waiting in the back parking lot. "Thank you, Anne." I walked out into the crisp Colorado air alone, feeling the sharp sting of the wind against my face as I began the solitary task of loading my son into a waiting rideshare vehicle. 45 minutes of traveling in a rideshare vehicle from the hospital back to my house felt like the longest period of silence I had ever experienced in my entire life. I pushed the front door open while clutching my newborn son tightly against my chest, expecting the familiar warmth of my home in Boulder to wash over me after 7 grueling days. Instead, a heavy stillness greeted me that was so profound I could actually hear the soft, rhythmic breathing of the infant in my arms. The initial relief of being back in my own space was immediately replaced by a sharp, instinctive surge of anxiety when I noticed the subtle disarray of the furniture. Several books had been knocked off the hallway console table, and the coat closet door stood slightly ajar in a way that suggested someone had been searching through it in a massive hurry. My best friend Elena, whom I had called in a state of sheer panic from the hospital curb, arrived just minutes later with a bag of groceries and a look of deep concern on her face. She immediately moved toward me to take the heavy car seat from my trembling hands, her presence providing the first real sense of security I had felt since the surgery. Elena insisted on settling the baby into his nursery while she prepared a light meal for me, urging me to use the opportunity to finally wash away the hospital grime. I managed to drag my aching legs toward the master bedroom every step, sending a fresh wave of sharp pain through my healing abdominal incision. My only intention was to shed the oversized, stained hospital clothes and find a clean set of pajamas before the exhaustion finally claimed what was left of my strength. The bedroom was even more disorganized than the hallway, with several drawers left pulled out and a pile of discarded shirts scattered across the foot of the bed. As I began to clear the mess so I could sit down, I accidentally knocked Jared's heavy winter jacket off the armchair, causing it to hit the hardwood floor with a muffled thud. A small white slip of paper slid out from the inner breast pocket and came to rest near my feet, catching the dim light filtering through the curtains. I bent down slowly to retrieve it, thinking it was merely an old dry cleaning receipt, or perhaps a business card from one of his many local clients. My vision blurred for a moment when I unfolded the paper and realized it was a detailed room service receipt from a luxury hotel located in the heart of Miami. The dates printed at the top of the thermal paper matched the first 3 days of my hospitalization with a cold, mathematical precision that made my stomach turn. I stood frozen in the middle of the room, staring at the itemized list of expensive cocktails and late-night dinners for 2 that were ordered while I was fighting through a post-surgical crisis alone. The business trip he had used as a frantic excuse suddenly transformed into a calculated act of betrayal that had been planned while I was preparing for the birth of our child. I felt the room begin to tilt on its axis, forcing me to reach out and grip the edge of the dresser to keep myself from collapsing onto the floor. Elena must have heard the sudden silence or sensed the shift in the atmosphere because she appeared in the doorway just as the receipt fluttered from my fingers. She rushed forward to steady me when she saw that I was visibly shaking and struggling to maintain my balance against the heavy wooden furniture. Elena caught my arm and held me upright when she realized that I was looking at her with a face that had turned a ghostly, bloodless shade of white within a matter of seconds. She asked in a frantic whisper what I had seen that could possibly cause such a violent physical reaction so soon after my discharge from the surgical ward. I reached down to pick up the receipt with a hand that felt completely disconnected from my body, holding it out toward her like a piece of radioactive evidence. I looked at her with wide, unblinking eyes and managed to say that he was in Miami, Elena. He was in Miami, while I was literally facing death in that hospital bed. The realization that my husband was lounging in a tropical resort while I was begging the nurses for information about his whereabouts made the air in the room feel suffocatingly thin. I sat down on the edge of the unmade bed, clutching the paper so hard that the edges began to tear while Elena stood in stunned silence beside me. The physical pain of my surgery was nothing compared to the cold, analytical clarity that began to settle over my mind as I realized I had been married to a stranger for years. I knew I couldn't afford to break down yet, because the evidence in my hand was only the beginning of a much larger and darker calculation. At 2 o'clock the following morning, while my surgical incision began to throb with a sharp and unrelenting intensity, I realized I could no longer continue playing the role of the helpless victim for even one more minute. The house was shrouded in a heavy, suffocating silence that seemed to amplify every creak of the floorboards as I slowly made my way toward the small home office at the end of the hallway. I sat down in the darkness of the room, lit only by the pale blue glow of my laptop screen, and prepared to log into our joint financial management system to assess exactly what remained of our family's resources before it was too late. As a professional accountant, I was accustomed to finding hidden truths within rows of cold numbers, yet nothing could have prepared me for the sheer audacity of the transactions staring back at me from the digital ledger. The digital records displayed with a brutal and undeniable clarity that Jared had been secretly siphoning $60,000 from our shared primary savings account over the course of the previous 7 days. Every withdrawal was linked to luxury expenditures in Florida, ranging from high-end resort fees to expensive jewelry purchases that were clearly not intended for his recovering wife. Elena had insisted on staying overnight to help me care for the infant, and her steady presence in the next room provided the only anchor I had while I navigated the wreckage of my financial security. She sat beside me in the dim light of the office, her expression one of grim determination, as she helped me photograph every single piece of digital evidence with my phone to ensure nothing could be deleted later. We worked in a state of focused, quiet intensity to forward these documents to a private encrypted email account that I had established years ago for my most sensitive professional work. Once the financial trail was secured, I reached for my phone with a trembling hand to place an emergency call to my lawyer, Bruce, despite the late hour. I provided Bruce with a concise summary regarding the Miami room service receipt and the unauthorized withdrawals, my voice remaining surprisingly steady as I detailed the systematic betrayal I had discovered. Bruce listened with the practiced patience of a man who had seen every possible variation of domestic greed, his calm tone providing a much-needed sense of order to the chaos surrounding me. During our conversation, Bruce instructed me on the specific legal steps required to protect my sole ownership of the Boulder property, confirming that the house remained a separate asset since I had purchased it long before the marriage began. He explained that we would immediately begin drafting a unilateral divorce filing based on financial fraud and abandonment, ensuring that the legal net would be ready to drop the moment my husband decided to return. I asked Bruce over the phone if I truly possessed the legal standing to force Jared to leave the premises immediately upon his return, my heart pounding against my ribs as I awaited his professional assessment. Bruce responded with a firm and absolute certainty that because the house was my sole separate property, he would help me prepare an emergency eviction notice that would be legally enforceable within a 24-hour window. This realization provided a cold, hard sense of purpose that began to override the physical pain in my abdomen, transforming my grief into a sharp and calculated strategy for survival. After ending the call, I took a deep breath and forced myself to systematically delete every trace of my recent computer activity to ensure that Jared would find absolutely nothing suspicious when he finally walked through the front door. I carefully tucked the original Miami receipt into a small fireproof safe hidden behind the bookshelves, locking away the physical proof of his infidelity alongside my newborn son's birth certificate. I made my way back to the nursery in the pre-dawn light, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of my son's chest, while I waited for the inevitable arrival of the man who thought he could destroy us. The physical agony of my recovery felt distant now, replaced by a crystalline clarity that allowed me to view my marriage as nothing more than a structural failure that required a controlled demolition. I knew that the coming days would require a level of performance I had never before attempted, but the legal fortress Bruce was building around us gave me the strength to remain silent. Every movement I made was now part of a larger invisible calculation, and I was prepared to wait as long as necessary to ensure that justice was served with the same cold precision Jared had used to betray me. Late in the afternoon of the 10th day since I had returned from the hospital, the familiar sound of tires crunching over the frozen snow in our driveway signaled that Jared had finally arrived home. I remained seated in my usual armchair in the living room, holding my sleeping son against my chest, while I watched the front door swing open with a sharp, echoing click. Jared stumbled into the house with a carefully staged look of exhaustion and disarray, his clothes intentionally wrinkled as if he had spent days traveling through a series of chaotic transit hubs. He began speaking before he even closed the door, offering a barrage of frantic apologies while blaming his long disappearance on a massive flight cancellation and a sudden broken phone in a remote area without any signal. I sat perfectly still in the fading light of the afternoon, observing the unmistakable flicker of guilt and hesitation in his eyes whenever he tried to look toward me. Jared went to great lengths to avoid making direct eye contact with the area where my surgical bandages were still clearly visible beneath the thin fabric of my loungewear. He began to recount an elaborate and completely illogical story about a business partner who had suffered a major emergency, forcing him to move constantly between various locations, where he claimed he was unable to reach out to me. Every detail he provided was a direct contradiction to the luxury itemized room service receipt currently hidden in the small fireproof safe in my office. Instead of challenging his transparent lies with the evidence I already possessed, I simply offered a pale, fragile smile and responded in a quiet, steady voice that I was just relieved to see him return safely after such a difficult trip. My lack of accusation seemed to catch him off guard for a brief second, but he quickly relaxed into a state of visible relief once he realized that I was apparently accepting his story without any further question. This silence on my part clearly made Jared feel more confident in his performance, because he immediately began to exhibit an exaggerated level of concern for our well-being. He moved toward the kitchen to begin tidying the countertops and offered to prepare a fresh bottle for our son as a way to atone for his long absence. My mother-in-law Janet arrived at the house shortly after Jared, bringing several containers of pre-cooked meals while enthusiastically reinforcing every single detail of her son's fabricated story. Janet claimed that she had been worried sick about the supposed flight delays acting as a polished backup for Jared's deception, while she carefully watched my reaction for any signs of suspicion. Jared reached out to gently rub my shoulder with a hand that felt uncomfortably cold against my skin, his voice dripping with a rehearsed quality of deep and sincere remorse. He whispered that he hated himself for not being there when I needed him the most, and he promised to spend every moment of the coming days making it up to both me and our son. I looked up at him and offered a small, appreciative nod, whispering that he should probably get some rest, because I knew he must have worked incredibly hard for the benefit of our family. Jared seemed pleased by my apparent submissiveness, unaware that I was internally documenting every shift in his tone and every dishonest gesture for my future legal proceedings. He spent the remainder of the evening moving with a newfound energy, attempting to reclaim his position as the devoted head of the household, while I watched him from the shadows of my own silence. The arrival of Jared and the subsequent performance by Janet only served to strengthen my resolve to proceed with the legal strategy Bruce had outlined for me during our midnight consultation. I allowed him to take over the household chores, watching with a detached clarity as he performed the role of the perfect husband for the benefit of an audience that no longer believed in him. Every helpful action he took felt like a calculated investment in his own survival, yet I remained patient because I knew that the legal net was already being woven around him. The physical pain of my recovery was manageable, now eclipsed by the intense focus required to maintain this delicate charade until the moment Bruce signaled that the documents were finalized. I remained a quiet observer in my own home, waiting for the inevitable moment when Jared's greed would finally lead him into the trap I had so carefully prepared. 3 weeks passed in the quiet rhythm of a domestic play that appeared peaceful on the surface while being riddled with the financial snares Jared was secretly laying beneath our feet. My husband exerted every ounce of effort to portray the image of a perfect reformed father by taking over the late-night feedings and preparing complex meals for my recovery process. However, his true motivations began to seep through the cracks of his performance whenever he steered our casual conversations toward the status of our remaining liquid assets. He spoke with a rehearsed urgency about needing a significant infusion of capital to salvage a supposed business investment that had allegedly collapsed during his time in Miami. Jared attempted to convince me that this new venture was our only path to financial security, pressuring me to sign the authorization forms required to release the final portion of our joint savings. I would sit at the kitchen table and accept the thick folder of documents from his hands, pretending to study the complex clauses while my mind remained focused on his ultimate betrayal. I offered him a calm, appreciative smile and promised that I would sign every document by the end of the coming week once my health had fully stabilized for the trip to the bank. While Jared basked in the misplaced confidence that he had successfully regained control of the situation, I continued to coordinate with Bruce through a series of encrypted email exchanges. We worked with a cold and methodical precision to finalize the legal paperwork required to initiate a total freeze on all shared accounts before Jared could initiate a single withdrawal. Elena visited the house almost every day to assist with the baby, maintained a professional distance that ensured Jared never suspected she was actually acting as my primary legal courier. She would arrive with a bag of groceries that conveniently hid in the sealed envelopes from Bruce, allowing me to sign the necessary affidavits while Jared was busy in the backyard. I actually began to find a grim sense of satisfaction in enjoying Jared's newfound devotion, viewing his labor as a small, inadequate down payment for the immense pain he had caused during my surgery. I watched him scrub the floors and mend the broken fence with a detached clarity, knowing that each helpful act was merely a calculated move in his own desperate game of greed. The house felt like a theatrical stage where we were both performing our assigned roles, yet I was the only one who truly understood when the final curtain would fall on our marriage. Jared walked into the kitchen during breakfast on Thursday morning and placed a heavy fountain pen directly on top of the financial release forms with an expectant look in his eyes. He leaned over my shoulder and whispered that a single signature from me would secure a prosperous future for our son and finally put the stress of the past month behind us. I looked at the legal documents for a long moment before slowly pushing the paper toward the far edge of the table to maintain my carefully constructed boundaries. I told him in a steady, unwavering voice that he should wait until Friday evening because I wanted us to share one truly peaceful meal together before we made such a permanent decision. Jared's expression flickered with a brief moment of frustration, but he quickly masked it with a nod of forced patience, believing that another 24 hours of subservience was a small price to pay for $60,000. He spent the remainder of the afternoon being even more attentive, unaware that every second was bringing him closer to the legal wall Bruce was building around his future. The physical agony of my C-section had almost entirely faded, replaced by a crystalline focus that allowed me to navigate this dangerous charade with the same precision I applied to my accounting ledgers. I spent the evening organizing my son's nursery, feeling a profound sense of relief that the legal net was now fully secured and waiting for the signal to drop. Jared sat in the living room reviewing his fraudulent investment plans, completely oblivious to the fact that his access to my life and my resources was about to be severed with a surgical level of finality. I remained the silent architect of my own liberation, watching the clock tick toward the Friday dinner that would finally strip away the mask of the man I had once trusted. The stage was now set for the ultimate confrontation, and I was prepared to deliver the final blow with the same cold, calculated indifference Jared had shown me in my hour of greatest need. At 7 o'clock on Friday evening, the rich aroma of grilled steak resting on the dining table marked the beginning of the end for a marriage built entirely on deception. Jared had spent the past hour meticulously setting out our finest silverware, while maintaining an upbeat conversation about the lucrative returns we would soon see from his upcoming business venture. He poured himself a generous glass of red wine with a confident flourish, completely oblivious to the fact that the legal trap had already been fully assembled beneath his feet. He raised his glass to offer a toast to our renewed family bond and expressed his deep gratitude for the unwavering trust I had shown him since his difficult return. I set my fork down quietly on the edge of the porcelain plate, deliberately breaking the cheerful rhythm he had worked so hard to establish throughout the evening meal. The silence that followed was heavy and immediate, stretching across the table, as I fixed my gaze directly onto his face, without offering the reassuring smile he was expecting. I asked him in a perfectly flat tone if the coastal weather had been pleasant during his stay, and whether the high-end room service had lived up to the hotel's luxury reputation. Jared's confident demeanor evaporated instantly, his complexion shifting from a flushed wine-induced pink to a sickly shade of ash gray within the span of a few heartbeats. He froze with the glass halfway to his mouth, his eyes darting frantically around the room as if searching for some invisible cue card to help him navigate this sudden deviation from his script. Before he could formulate a coherent lie, I reached into the hidden pocket of my cardigan and pulled out the folded hotel receipt along with the printed bank statements. I slowly pushed the damning evidence across the polished surface of the dining table until it came to a halt, right next to his carefully arranged dinner plate. The numbers highlighted in bright yellow marker clearly detailed the systematic withdrawal of $60,000, aligning perfectly with the itemized charges from the resort in Florida. Jared stared at the documents as if they were venomous snakes, his mouth opening and closing silently, while his brain struggled to comprehend that his carefully constructed reality had just collapsed. He finally began to stammer out a series of broken sentences, attempting to weave a new narrative about being forced into taking the trip by aggressive corporate partners. Every word that tumbled from his lips only served to deepen the hole he had dug for himself, rendering his apologies meaningless under the harsh glare of the dining room lights. I did not scream at him or sweep the dishes off the table in a fit of rage, choosing instead to let the overwhelming weight of the evidence crush his pathetic excuses into silence. The profound contempt in my eyes conveyed more devastation than any shouted insult ever could, forcing the man who had abandoned his recovering wife to face the absolute ruin of his own making. I watched him physically shrink back into his chair as the reality of his situation settled over him, the false bravado entirely stripped away to reveal the cowardly core I had failed to see for years. I cut off his frantic babbling with a sharp movement of my hand, my voice cutting through the heavy air with a cold precision that offered absolutely no room for negotiation. You were not in Miami for business, Jared. You were there spending our son's future savings and trading my very survival for a luxury vacation. Jared dropped his fork onto the hardwood floor with a sharp clatter, his hands trembling visibly as he leaned forward in a desperate attempt to bridge the physical distance between us. Kara, please listen to me. I was pressured into going. It was a terrible mistake, and I promise I can fix everything if you just give me a chance. I remained perfectly still in my chair, allowing his pleas to echo uselessly against the walls of the home he was about to lose forever. The finality of my decision had already been cemented in legal ink, and no amount of retroactive guilt could alter the consequence of his betrayal. Exactly at 8 o'clock in the evening, while Jared was still desperately attempting to beg for my forgiveness, the sharp chime of the doorbell echoed through the hallway to signal the official conclusion of his elaborate theatrical performance. Bruce stepped confidently into the foyer accompanied by a stern process server who immediately handed Jared a thick envelope containing our finalized divorce filings, along with a strict court order freezing all of his personal accounts connected to the recent fraudulent withdrawals. I stood up slowly from the dining table to present him with the final piece of documentation, which was a legally binding eviction notice, giving him exactly 24 hours to vacate the property that I had purchased entirely under my own name prior to our wedding. The expression on Jared's face rapidly shifted from pathetic pleading to genuine explosive rage as he finally processed the grim reality of losing his comfortable lifestyle in a matter of seconds. His sudden burst of aggressive anger was instantly neutralized when Bruce calmly mentioned our firm intention to forward the irrefutable evidence of his financial embezzlement directly to the board of directors at his corporate firm. Realizing that any further resistance would completely destroy his professional career, alongside his failed marriage, Jared walked heavily toward the master bedroom to shove a handful of random clothing items into a small travel suitcase, in a state of utter humiliation. Bruce remained standing near the entryway with his arms crossed silently, ensuring that my former partner did not attempt to take any valuable assets or crucial financial documents on his way out. I stood quietly in the hallway watching him frantically zip up the bag with trembling hands, feeling absolutely no sympathy for the man who was now experiencing a fraction of the intense isolation I had endured during my hospitalization. His movements were clumsy out of pure panic, dropping several shirts onto the carpet before shoving them back into the overcrowded luggage in a pathetic display of defeat. He dragged his suitcase toward the front exit with his head bowed low, his footsteps sounding unusually loud against the hardwood floors of the house he no longer had any legal right to occupy. He paused directly on the threshold with the freezing Colorado winter wind blowing past his shoulders, turning back to look at the warm living room he was leaving behind forever. Jared turned his face toward me and shouted in a voice cracking with utter desperation, "Are you really going to throw away 10 years of our life together just because of one single week of mistakes?" I met his frantic gaze without blinking and replied in a tone as cold as the ice forming on the driveway outside, "You threw it all away the moment you boarded that plane to Miami while I was lying on the operating table. Get out, Jared." The heavy front door of the Boulder house slammed shut behind his retreating figure, with a deeply satisfying finality, sealing the bitter cold outside, bringing a profound, unbroken silence back into my sanctuary. I took a deep breath of the quiet air before walking down the hall to the nursery to gently pick up my sleeping son from his crib, holding his warm little body against my chest as a genuine wave of absolute relief finally washed over my exhausted mind. The oppressive, suffocating weight of living with a liar had been lifted entirely from my shoulders, leaving the physical space feeling clean and remarkably peaceful for the very first time in nearly a full month. We were finally free from the toxic web of his financial greed, perfectly ready to begin a completely new chapter of life together on our own terms without ever looking back at the wreckage he created. The painful surgical recovery I had been forced to endure alone suddenly felt like a necessary trial that had effectively purged a massive vulnerability from my existence. I kissed the top of my baby's head in the dim light of the nursery, knowing with absolute certainty that this quiet, secure environment was exactly what we needed to thrive independently. Representing the production team behind this channel, we want to affirm that this story serves a strict educational purpose. Our primary goal is to effectively transmit a powerful message regarding the importance of personal boundaries and handling domestic crises with pure logic and legal precision. Looking objectively at the unfolding events, the female protagonist demonstrated remarkable resilience by decisively protecting herself and severing all ties completely without offering any unearned forgiveness. The manipulative antagonist ultimately suffered the inevitable devastating consequences that stemmed directly from his own selfish decisions and blatant disregard for his family's survival. When the heavy door of that Boulder house finally closed, the profound peace achieved was expensive, but entirely worthwhile. Here are the core lessons we must take away from Kara's journey. Women must strictly maintain complete control over their independent finances and separate property assets because financial autonomy acts as the ultimate lifesaver during times of unexpected betrayal. Victims should never waste their energy screaming or crying at a deceitful partner because quietly gathering solid legal evidence will always deliver the most definitive and victorious resolution. Extreme greed and abandonment during a life-threatening medical crisis represent an unforgivable violation of fundamental trust, meaning a complete severance of the relationship is the only path toward a secure future. We want to send our most sincere gratitude to all the patient viewers who stayed to listen to the very end of this incredible journey. We truly appreciate your continued support. Do you fully agree with Kara's decision to ruthlessly kick Jared out into the cold night? Tell us exactly how you would have handled this betrayal by leaving your thoughts in the comments section below.
Dù chỉ là một tác phẩm hư cấu, câu chuyện của Kara phản chiếu những góc khuất rất thực tế về hôn nhân khi đối mặt với sự phản bội tàn nhẫn, bị người chồng bỏ rơi ngay trên bàn sinh mổ để đi nghỉ dưỡng tại Miami bằng tiền chung. Kara không chọn cách gào thét, việc cô điềm tĩnh cất giấu hóa đơn khách sạn, âm thầm gọi luật sư và đóng băng tài khoản là minh chứng cho thấy bản lĩnh tuyệt vời. Cô đã biến nỗi đau thành đòn đáp trả pháp lý lạnh lùng, tống đạt lệnh trục xuất ngay tại bàn ăn. Bài học đắt giá được rút ra rằng vũ khí bảo vệ phụ nữ quyền lực nhất không phải là nước mắt mà chính là sự độc lập tài chính và lòng tự trọng. Bằng chứng thực tế luôn mang lại chiến thắng vang dội hơn mọi cuộc cãi vã ồn ào. Bạn đánh giá thế nào về cách xử lý đầy lý trí của Kara? Hãy bình luận và chia sẻ quan điểm của bạn ở ngay